So this workshop is going to begin to explore the current educational neuroscience research that's out there and how we can begin to apply that to our classrooms to help us as teachers, but also support our students in their enjoyment of learning and also their overall attainment. By examining the brain and the processes that are actually going on in the brain, we're able to see what's occurring in real time under many different circumstances. And from that, we can begin to look at what can be altered or done to help our students attain optimal learning. This workshop aims to explore what stress is, how stress impacts us, and the different ways that we can prepare our mind and our bodies to handle stress in the best possible way to have optimal performance under pressure. So what did we cover today? Today we learned a little bit about what stress is, how we physically and psychologically respond to stress. We learned about the different parts of the brain that are activated when we're starting to feel stressed. And we learned about appraisal and how it lets us assess if a situation is stressful or not. And then we were also able to learn a few different mental tools that we can use, such as progressive muscle relaxation with deep breathing, imagery, and goal setting to help us handle that stress in a more positive way. Today we're going to be discussing sleep and the importance of it and how it might be impacting not only our revision but actually our exam stress levels. So why is sleep important? So it's great that we've been able to identify the ways that we feel when we have a good night's sleep and the ways that we feel when we have a bad night's sleep, but what are the actual benefits of sleep? Well, first and foremost, when we're sleeping, our brain is able to process and retain information, which is very important during revision, as we know. When we're asleep, it also triggers the brain to start making changes and also strengthening different connections within the brain. Additionally, it helps us to improve our mental well-being and influences things like decision-making, retention, focus, and attention. And it also allows increases in our creativity so that we can start to have those aha moments or those breakthroughs when we're revising that help us to learn and retain that information. So in order for us to limit the negative impact that stress is having, we first have to begin to identify what we're finding stressful about the exams and the situations that we're in when we are taking an exam. Once we begin to know that, we can find out how we're actually physically and psychologically responding to those stressors. Now, once we answer those two questions, we begin to be able to put together the pieces of the puzzle that let us know how we're going to be able to help prevent those negative feelings of stress and turn them into a bit more positive feelings so that our performance doesn't suffer in the moment. Now, examination of the brain has found that there are three main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Now, as you can see, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it's divided into the right and left hemispheres. So this workshop is going to explore what stress is, how it impacts us, and how we can best prepare ourselves to handle stress in a positive way to achieve optimal performance outcome. So quickly, what we're going to discuss: what stress is. We're going to talk about how we respond to stress, what stress actually does to our brain, can stress be good or bad, how to prepare for stress, and then we're actually going to try out a few different mental tools that can hopefully help us prepare for stress and experience it in a more positive way. So what is stress? Now, everyone has experienced stress at some point in their lives, and it's important that we acknowledge its prevalence. It's happening to a lot of us all of the time. But before we can move into how can we deal with stress, it's important that we understand what stress is. So as you can see, stress is when the perceived demands of a task are greater than your perceived ability to cope with those demands. So if we're put into a situation where we feel like we have the tools necessary to accomplish that task or deal with that task, we're less likely to perceive it as a negative stressor. Now, if we go into a situation where we do not feel prepared, we're more likely to interpret that as a negative stressor that can impact how we respond. Now, there are two main types of stress. There's acute stress and there's chronic stress. Now, acute stress is our immediate reaction to a stressor, right? It's when our fight or our flight mode is activated and we have to determine how we're going to approach something immediately. Our chronic stress is our reaction to a stressor that is occurring over time on a consistent basis. So it's something that we're dealing with daily or weekly. And in turn, that starts to become a negative. If we're dealing with something chronically and chronic stress, our brains are starting to actually release chemicals that can can actually hurt how we deal with stress in the long run. So how do we respond to stress? Now there's two main ways that we can respond to stress. There's the psychological response and there's the physical response. Now the physical response can be something that is internal or external. So internally we might have those things like butterflies in our stomach, and externally we might have things such as sweat in our armpits or we might have a rash or become flushed. Psychologically, there's three ways that we can begin experiencing stress. We've got our cognitive reaction, our emotional reaction, and our perceptual reaction to stress. So now that we know a little bit more about what stress is and the possible ways that we can react to stress, both physically and psychologically, we want to know now how we can actually prepare for stress. So we've got both physical and psychological ways that we can prepare for stress. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you now through one of the psychological approaches, which is imagery, or also known as visualization. Now, just a little bit of background on imagery and visualization. It shows how powerful the brain can actually be. Now, what it involves using all five senses to come up with a mental image. So, for instance, if we're talking about an upcoming exam, it's putting yourself in that exam condition. So what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're seeing, what you're feeling, all of those senses coming together to form this mental picture that is in depth and shows as much detail as possible. Now that detail is important because research has found that the more detail that you can put into these mental images, the more neural connections in the brain actually start connecting. So even just by mentally picturing yourself accomplishing a task or doing a certain skill, you're actually having those connections in the brain fire as if you were physically doing it. Now this is important because it can begin to help you think of different ways to handle different stressors that pop up or different hurdles that you might experience, or on the flip side of that, actually prepare you to become maybe less negatively stressed when you're going into a situation because your body and your mind has prepared for it already. So one of the things we do to kind of have you guys go through imagery and visualization is to have you think of a situation, a specific situation that you have coming up that maybe you're feeling a little bit nervous or stressed out about. So what you're going to do is you're going to start to think about that situation, and you're going to start to, like I said, put as much detail into that situation as possible. Okay, so what are you feeling physically and mentally? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you tasting? And as you start to develop that picture, I want you to start thinking about the positive outcomes that could come from it. So again, if we go back to our example of being in an exam, am I feeling the pen in my hand? Am I seeing the paper in front of me? How do I start to put those positive outcomes in? Maybe I start to see questions that I know the answers to, and I start to answer them in a positive way. Maybe I come across a question that I'm not too sure about, but I'm allowing myself to mentally picture myself taking a second, taking a deep breath, being prepared to approach that question in a positive way, and maybe it's also identified something that I need to go away and revise a little bit more. So imagery and visualization can be a very valuable tool to not only help you approach and deal with stress, but also have you accomplish higher performance outcomes.